In 1866, Charles Goodnight nailed a grub box to the back of an army surplus wagon and invented something that would feed 500,000 men driving cattle from Texas to Montana. But here is what nobody tells you. The meals those cowboys cooked over open fires with nothing but a cast iron pot and whatever fit in that wagon were not just survival food. Food scientists have recently discovered that slow cooking beans with salt pork creates a gut-healthy environment that modern probiotics cannot replicate. Number 8 on this list was banned from polite dinner conversation for a century, yet it contains more protein per dollar than almost anything in your grocery store today. And number 1 was so effective at feeding men working 16-hour days in brutal conditions that railroad companies secretly copied the recipe and served it to their own crews without ever giving cowboys the credit. These 25 meals were born in dust and fire, cooked by men who had one pot, one fire, and mouths to feed before sunup. Then processed food arrived. Convenience culture convinced America that cooking in one pot was beneath us. It was wrong. Before we start, hit subscribe, because what you are about to learn might change how you cook forever. Let us count down the 25 forgotten one-pot meals cowboys cooked on the open range. Number 25, ash cake. Before the chuck wagon arrived on cattle drives, cowboys baked directly in the coals. They mixed cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt, shaped the dough into a flat round, wrapped it in wet corn husks or green leaves if they could find them, and buried it in hot ash at the edge of the fire. 30 minutes later, they brushed off the gray crust to reveal a dense, crumbly cake that had baked in its own natural shell. No pan, no grease, nothing but heat and earth. This was trail cooking stripped to the bone, a technique learned from Native American cooks who had perfected it over centuries. Cornmeal cost about 2 cents a pound in 1870, and a single bag could keep a cowboy fed for 2 weeks. The outside blackened slightly, adding a smoky bitterness that offset the naturally sweet grain. Men tore pieces and ate them with dried beef or dunked them in whatever stew was heating nearby. No plates needed, no washing up. You ate from your hands and got back to work before the herd drifted. Number 24, sow belly and greens. Salt pork, cut from the belly of a hog and cured until it was half salt and half fat, rode in every chuck wagon from Texas to Kansas. Cowboys called it sow belly. It cost almost nothing, kept for months without refrigeration, and transformed every pot it entered. A good trail cook would dice a quarter pound of sow belly, render it until the fat melted out, then add whatever wild greens grew near the water source, lamb's quarter, dandelion, or mustard weed. These are plants that modern foragers charge $15 a pound for at farmers markets. The greens wilted into the salty pork fat until they turned silky and deeply savory. The pot liquor at the bottom was eaten with cornbread soaked in it. Not a drop will draw it wasted. Trail cooks knew what nutrition science has recently confirmed. The combination of rendered animal fat and bitter greens creates fat-soluble vitamin absorption that eating salad alone simply cannot match. Cowboys eating sow belly and greens were getting more from their food than men at hotel tables eating beefsteak. Number 23, pot liquor soup. When the sow belly pot had been eaten down to scraps, the liquid left behind, dark, salty, and thick with dissolved nutrients from the greens, became the base for the next meal. Cowboys called this pot liquor. They would add dried beans and a handful of cornmeal stirred in to thicken it, then let the whole pot simmer low for the better part of an afternoon while the herd rested. The result was a soup that tasted like it had been cooking for a week, because in a sense it had. The pot liquor carried flavor from every previous meal, building depth with each use. This was cumulative cooking, a rolling pot that never fully emptied, it just got replenished. A technique so ancient and effective that European peasant cooks had been doing the same thing for centuries. Modern food culture throws away pot liquor every single day. Cowboys knew they were throwing away the best part. Out on the open range, the land fed you if you knew how to look. Cowboys supplemented the chuck wagon rations with whatever they could shoot, and jackrabbits were everywhere. They were lean and tough, and if you did not know what you were doing, they cooked up dry and stringy. But a good camp cook knew the answer was always the same. The answer was low and slow in the Dutch oven, with onions and whatever dried herbs the wagon carried. Brown the pieces in rendered fat until dark on both sides. Add water, a handful of dried onion, salt, pepper, and maybe a pinch of cayenne if the cook was feeling generous. Put the lid on and let the pot sit on a bed of coals for 2 hours. What came out was tender enough to fall from the bone. The tough connective tissue dissolved into a rich, almost gelatinous gravy. One jackrabbit could stretch to feed 6 hungry men. That was the mathematics of the open range. Make do, waste nothing, feed everyone. Number 21, camp flapjacks, camp sourdough flapjacks. Chuck wagon cooks mixed sourdough starter with cornmeal or flour every morning before dawn. The starter, sometimes called the mother, was treated with more care than the horses. Lose the herd, and the boss docks your pay. Lose the sourdough starter, and you face a mutiny. A thick batter was ladled onto a cast-iron skillet greased with the rind of sow belly. The flapjacks hit the pan with a sigh and a sizzle, rising in the cold morning air until the bubbles broke on top and the edges set dry. Flipped once, served in stacks with molasses drizzled over the top. A cowboy ate 4 or 5 before climbing into the saddle for a 12-hour day. The sourdough fermentation provided B vitamins, the molasses provided iron, and the cooking fat provided sustained energy. No protein shake, no performance nutrition bar, just a pan, a fire, and a cook who understood his men needed fuel before sunup. Number 20, wild onion and potato hash. Potatoes were the one fresh vegetable that could survive a cattle drive. Hardy, calorie-dense, and willing to sit in a sack for weeks, they were the foundation for dozens of camp meals. Cowboys diced them into rough cubes, threw them in a skillet with rendered fat and whatever wild onions grew along the creek beds, and cooked them hard until the edges blistered and browned. No seasoning beyond salt and pepper, no technique beyond patience. But something happened in that pan. The natural sugars in the potato caramelized against the iron, the wild onions sweetened as they cooked, and the dish became greater than its parts. Cowboys ate this for breakfast, lunch, and supper without complaint. The men who drove Longhorns from Texas to Montana in 1876 burned more calories in a day than a modern marathon runner. They needed this, and it delivered. Number 19, Pemmican stew. Cowboys learned this from the Plains Indians and the mountain men who preceded them on the frontier. Pemmican was dried meat, usually buffalo in earlier years and beef later, pounded fine and mixed with rendered tallow and dried berries until it formed a dense, waxy cake. On its own, it kept for years without spoiling, but dropped into a pot of boiling water with dried corn and wild turnips, it became a stew that could sustain a man through conditions that would stop a modern hiker cold. Native American warriors survived on pemmican alone for weeks during winter hunts. Cowboys discovered what nutritional science would not formally document until this century. Fat is not the enemy. It is the fuel. First pattern break. Here is where things get uncomfortable. In 1898, the U.S. Army studied what cowboys ate on long drives and published a report calling the diet nutritionally deficient. Too much fat, too little variety. The report was used to justify replacing traditional camp cooking with processed rations in military campaigns. But here is what that report buried in a footnote. The cowboys on long drives averaged 180 days in the saddle, performing physical labor that modern sports medicine classifies as extreme. And they did it on beans, salt pork, and cornmeal without a single vitamin supplement. The men who later ate the Army's improved rations reported lower energy, worse morale, and more illness. The processed food industry spent decades citing that 1898 report. They never mentioned the footnote. Number 18, dried apple stack cake. Sugar was expensive and fragile on the trail. It traveled in tight-lidded tins and was rationed like medicine. But dried apples, available cheap at any supply town, could sweeten a camp dessert when nothing else could. The cook would rehydrate the apples in a small amount of water, mash them with spices if he had them, and layer them between flat rounds of sourdough cake baked in the Dutch oven. Stack 5 or 6 layers. Let the whole thing sit overnight, wrapped in a clean cloth. By morning, the moisture from the apples had softened each layer into something that sliced clean and tasted like a serious effort had been made. Cowboys who had been weeks without anything sweet would go quiet eating this. Men who argued over everything fell silent over dried apple stack cake. The chuck wagon cook who could make it was paid more and treated better than one who could not. That is the mathematics of hunger and gratitude. Number 17, molasses and biscuits. Molasses was the sweetener of the American frontier. Cheaper than sugar, longer lasting than honey, and calorie-dense in the way a man burning 4,000 calories a day required. Every chuck wagon carried a jug, black and thick, and at the end of a long day, the cook would set a pan of sourdough biscuits and a tin of molasses on the tailgate. Cowboys poured the syrup over the biscuits and ate standing up, still dusty from the herd. Molasses provided iron, calcium, and B vitamins. The sourdough biscuits provided fermented grain with better bioavailability than the refined white bread appearing in eastern cities at the time. A cowboy eating biscuits and molasses at sunset was, entirely by accident, eating something nutritionally superior to what wealthy men in Boston were sitting down to for dinner. The frontier fed people better than refinement did. That is a fact the food industry has never been comfortable with. Number 16, hardtack skillet. Hardtack was Army surplus and frontier survival in a single dense cracker. Made from flour, water, and salt, baked until virtually indestructible, it lasted indefinitely if kept dry and was despised by every man who ever chewed one straight. But a camp cook with ingenuity did not serve hardtack straight. He broke it into a skillet with rendered fat and water, let it absorb and soften until it was nearly a porridge, then fried it hard on both sides until it held its shape like a patty. Salt, pepper, and a slice of salt pork on the side, and suddenly hardtack was a meal. The Army called it emergency rations. Cowboys called the skillet version a miracle of small imagination. The technique of softening and frying was the difference between eating to survive and eating to keep going. Subtle as that distinction sounds, on a cattle drive in a Wyoming February, it was the difference between everything. Number 15, prairie oyster scramble. This one made greenhorns hesitate and veterans laugh. When calves were branded on the trail, the removed testicles, known as prairie oysters or mountain oysters, depending on which state you were crossing, went straight into the camp skillet. Wasting nothing was not just a philosophy on the open range. It was a survival strategy enforced by simple economics. A cook would split them, dust them in cornmeal, and fry them in hot tallow until the outside turned crisp and golden. They were served with scrambled eggs if the wagon had them, which often it did not, or eaten plain with a splash of vinegar. The flavor was mild, the texture rich, and the protein content higher than most cuts of muscle meat. Branding days became the best eating on a long drive because of this single dish. Cowboys who refused on their first drive ate them eagerly by their third. Hunger is the greatest seasoning, and pride is expensive on the open range. Number 14. Cattleman's burgu. Burgu is the forgotten ancestor of every great American stew. It began as a Kentucky hunting dish, spread through Civil War mess halls, where soldiers threw everything available into one pot, and arrived on the cattle trails in the 1870s as the solution to the end-of-the-week problem. What do you do with every partial ingredient remaining before you hit a supply town? Everything. Dried beans sitting since Monday, a heel of salt pork, wild onions, the last of the cornmeal stirred in to thicken, a jackrabbit shot that morning, whatever the land offered alongside, whatever the wagon still carried, cooked together low and slow for half a day until the whole thing became something no one could quite identify, but everyone wanted more of. Burgu had no recipe. It was a philosophy. Use everything. Waste nothing. Feed the men. That philosophy built the American West. Number 13. Cornmeal mush. Before oatmeal was sold in decorated boxes with smiling Quakers on the label, the American frontier ran on cornmeal mush. The recipe was simple: 1 cup of coarse ground cornmeal, 3 cups of water, and a pinch of salt. Bring the pot to a boil, stir constantly until thick, then lower the heat and let it bubble slowly for 20 minutes. It sounds too simple to matter. But a bowl of hot mush, eaten in a cold saddle camp at 4 in the morning with a tin cup of black coffee, is a meal a man can work 12 hours on without feeling the bottom fall out. Cowboys ate it soft for breakfast. Let the remainder set up in the pan, then slice and fry it for supper, the edges turning crisp and golden in the tallow. Same ingredient, 2 entirely different textures, 2 meals from 1 pot. Efficiency so elegant that American food companies spent most of the 20th century trying to replace it with products that cost 10 times as much and worked half as well. Second pattern break. In 1890, a New York advertising executive was hired by a Midwestern grain company to write copy convincing American families that cornmeal was poverty food, crude, rural, shameful. The campaign worked. Within 20 years, self-rising flour, baking powder, and packaged cereals had displaced cornmeal in millions of American homes. The company that funded that campaign made 400% more profit per pound selling processed flour than selling cornmeal. Cowboys had been eating cornmeal because it was nutritionally dense, calorie-rich, and cheap. They were right. We bought the advertising instead. Number 12. Stale biscuit bread pudding. Nothing left the chuck wagon as waste. When biscuits went hard and stale after a day, as sourdough always did, the camp cook collected them, broke them into a Dutch oven, and poured in a mixture of water, condensed milk if the wagon carried it, sugar if any remained, and dried fruit. He set the Dutch oven on coals, piled more coals on the lid, and baked it for 40 minutes until the biscuits had absorbed every drop of liquid and the top was browned and slightly crusty. Cowboys ate it warm from the pot. There was no plate ceremony on the open range. You took your portion, you ate it, and you went back to work. But for a few minutes, sitting by a fire in the dark of the Texas Panhandle with a bowl of warm, sweet pudding, A man might almost feel like something beyond a tool for moving cattle across a continent. Number 11. Vinegar pie. Lemons and cream were luxuries no chuck wagon carried, but vinegar kept indefinitely, and sugar traveled in sealed tins. A clever cook could turn those two humble ingredients into something that passed for dessert on the open range. He mixed sugar, flour, water, and a generous pour of apple cider vinegar, cooked it until it thickened into a tart, glossy filling, then poured it into a sourdough crust baked in the Dutch oven. The result tasted like lemon pie to men who had not tasted anything sweet in 3 weeks. The tartness of the vinegar tricked the brain into perceiving something far more refined. Cowboys did not care what they were being tricked into. They cared that the cook had made something sweet at the end of a hard day. Vinegar pie was a monument to ingenuity, making luxury from poverty, making something from nothing. That was the cowboy way of cooking. Number 10. Dutch oven bread. The Dutch oven was the most important piece of equipment on the cattle trail. A thick-walled cast-iron pot with legs so it could sit over coals, and a flanged lid so coals could be piled on top, it turned every campfire into a proper oven. A good trail cook could bake bread in it that rivaled what came out of a proper bakehouse. They mixed sourdough starter with flour and salt, left it to rise under a cloth in the shade of the wagon during the morning ride, then set the dough in a greased Dutch oven with coals above and below. An hour later, they had a golden loaf with a crackling crust and a soft, tangy interior. Fresh bread on the open range. It sounds impossible. It was not. It was simply a matter of knowing how to use what you had. That knowledge was worth more than almost any other skill a man could carry into the wilderness. Number 9. Trail chili. Real trail chili has no beans. That is not a regional preference. It is a historical fact rooted in necessity. Cowboys carried dried chilies, dried beef, or fresh butchered meat, rendered fat, and wild garlic. The meat was cut small and fried hard in tallow until browned. Then the dried chilies, soaked and ground by hand, went in with water, and the pot simmered low for 2 hours. What emerged was thick, dark red, deeply spiced, and ferocious in a way that modern chili powder approximations cannot replicate. Dried whole chilies provide a complexity of heat and flavor that pre-ground powder destroys in processing. Cowboys ate trail chili from the pot with sourdough bread or cornmeal biscuits. They had no opinion on the beans debate because there was no debate. Beans were a different meal. Chili was this. Third pattern. Break. Here is something old El Paso and every major chili powder company would prefer you did not look into. When the American chili powder industry consolidated in the 19-teens, they began grinding together dozens of different dried chili varieties that cowboys and Mexican vaqueros had always used separately, each for different purposes, different heat levels, different flavors. They ground everything into one uniform powder, added salt and cumin, and sold it as authentic trail seasoning. Revenue from that single product line exceeded the entire regional cattle industry in some states by 1920. They simplified and commodified a complex regional cooking tradition and sold it back to Americans as the original. The original was made with whole dried peppers and patience. It was something else entirely. Number 8. Salt pork and beans. This is the foundation of trail cooking. It is the meal that appears in every diary, every memoir, every account of life on the cattle drives, and yet almost nobody makes it the way it was made. Dried beans were soaked overnight in creek water. Salt pork was diced and rendered in the bottom of the Dutch oven until the fat ran clear. The soaked beans were added with enough water to cover by 2 inches. The lid was sealed. The pot was set in a bed of coals and left for 6 to 8 hours while the world went about its business. What happened inside that sealed pot over those hours was a slow transformation. The collagen in the salt pork dissolved into the bean liquid. The bean skins softened until they nearly disappeared. The fat coated every surface of every bean until the whole thing became one unified, deeply savory mass. Archaeologists and food scientists studying pioneer nutrition have found evidence that the slow heat in these sealed pots created beneficial microbial compounds similar to traditional fermented foods. Cowboys eating salt pork and beans every night were inadvertently maintaining gut health in conditions that should have destroyed it. Number 7. Mulligan stew. Mulligan stew is the American equivalent of pot liquor and burgu combined. It was the stew of the broke and the wandering, the meal made when a man had almost nothing and needed to feed himself and whoever had drifted into camp. Any meat, any vegetable, any grain that could be found, gathered, shot, or traded for went into the pot. Trail hands between jobs, cowboys in the off-season, and later the hobos of the Depression era all lived on Mulligan. The name is disputed. Some say it comes from an Irish surname. Others say it simply means a stew of miscellaneous character, which is accurate enough. The only rule was that everything went in. Nothing was too humble, nothing too small. A mulligan with 2 jackrabbit legs, a handful of dried beans, 3 potatoes, and a knuckle of salt pork fed 4 men through a cold night. The mathematics of scarcity always worked in a good mulligan. That is the genius of a meal with no rules except waste nothing. Number 6. Sourdough biscuits. The sourdough mother rode in a covered crock lashed to the chuck wagon, and the cook protected it with a ferocity usually reserved for ammunition and whiskey. Cowboys knew that if the starter died, so did the bread, the flapjacks, the cake, and any pretense of a meal worth rising for. A good sourdough biscuit from the open range was pulled from the Dutch oven, golden on top, risen to twice its raw height, tangy from the fermentation, with a structure that held together when you split it and ran butter across the interior if butter was available, molasses if it was not, or you just ate it plain when neither could be found. Modern sourdough has become expensive and fashionable. In 1875, it was poor man's bread, available to anyone willing to tend the starter. The fermentation process that specialty bakeries currently charge a premium for was the free daily bread of the American frontier. Cowboys never called it artisan. They called it Tuesday. Number 5. Spotted pup. Every cattle drive had a cook who knew how to make spotted pup, and those cooks were legends. The name sounds like a joke, but it was not. Rice cooked low and slow in the Dutch oven with dried raisins and condensed milk, or with just water and sugar if nothing else was available, turned into a sweet, sticky pudding that the raisins dotted like spots across the back of a pup. Hence the name. Rice was a staple trail food because it lasted indefinitely and cooked in one pot with minimal water. On its own, it was fuel. Spotted pup was something else entirely. It was morale. A Dutch oven of spotted pup, appearing at the end of a hard week, told men that the cook cared, that somebody was paying attention to whether they were human beings or just moving parts in a cattle operation. The cooks who made spotted pup regularly kept their jobs. Cowboys voted with their appetites. They always did. Number 4. Son of a gun stew. When a calf was butchered on the trail, nothing was wasted. The meal that made use of everything, the heart, the liver, the tongue, the sweetbreads, the kidneys, All of it diced fine and stewed together in a Dutch oven with onions, chilies, and whatever else the wagon carried was called son-of-a-gun stew in polite company. Cowboys used a different term among themselves. The marrow gut was the most prized ingredient, a tube of fat and organ tissue from just weaned calves that melted into the stew and gave it a richness no muscle meat could match. Trail bosses ate son-of-a-gun stew at the same fire as the lowest hand because everyone wanted the cook to give them a generous ladle. Social hierarchies dissolved over a good pot. It was the great equalizer of the cattle drive, a meal so extraordinary that rank and dignity were temporarily suspended in the interest of getting a second helping. Number 3, Cowboy coffee. It is not a meal on its own, but there is not a single meal on this list that existed separately from it, so it earns its place. Cowboys boiled coffee in a pot directly over the fire. A full handful of coarse grounds per person, cold water poured over, brought to a boil, then a splash of cold water tossed in to settle the grounds to the bottom, black. Always black. No sugar, unless a man had earned it, no cream, because cream did not survive past the first supply town. The caffeine in camp coffee brewed this way runs significantly. Stronger than drip coffee because of the longer extraction time and the higher heat. Cowboys drank it before dawn and used it to warm their hands against a tin cup in the cold dark before the work began. Modern specialty coffee charges $7 for something approximating what chuck wagon cooks made for pennies. The difference is mostly furniture and lighting. Fourth pattern break. Folgers was founded in San Francisco in 1850. By 1900, the company was running advertisements in Eastern newspapers specifically targeting frontier culture, implying that ground and processed coffee was what sophisticated Americans drank, and that boiling coffee in a pot was primitive behavior. They hired illustrators to depict cowboys as rough and backward, and modern coffee drinkers as refined and respectable. The campaign worked so completely that the very method of brewing that produced stronger, more fully extracted coffee became associated with poverty and ignorance. Folgers sold people an inferior product and convinced them it was an upgrade. The original was better. It almost always was. Number 2, the end of the week, everything stew. There was a meal that had no name because it was every meal. At the end of each week on the trail, the chuck wagon cook took stock of what remained and made a calculation. What can still be stretched? What will not survive another week on a rattling wagon? What can be combined so that nothing is wasted? That calculation produced a stew of such complexity and depth that experienced trail hands could tell by smell alone what day of the week it was being made. Old beans, the heel of the salt pork, dried corn, whatever dried herbs remained, a handful of flour stirred in to thicken, water to cover, the lid sealed, and the pot buried in coals. This stew cooked while camp was broken, while the herd was gathered, while everything that needed doing was done. It was ready when it needed to be ready. The ingredients were different every week, but the result was always the same. A meal that tasted of everything the week had been, dense with accumulated flavor and the particular genius of cooking with nothing and making something worth gathering around. Number 1, son of a bitch in a sack. The greatest one-pot meal the American West ever produced was not elegant. Its real name was not printable in newspapers until well into the 20th century. It was a suet pudding, borrowed from English and Scottish tradition and rebuilt by chuck wagon cooks into something the frontier could claim entirely as its own. Rendered beef fat mixed with flour, dried fruit, molasses, and whatever spices the wagon carried was wrapped tight in a cloth sack and boiled in a pot of water for 3 hours. When the sack was unwrapped, what emerged was dense, dark, sweet, and savory at once. A pudding that required no baking equipment beyond a pot, a fire, and patience. It appeared at the end of cattle drives. It appeared at Christmas camps when men were far from any family. It appeared when a trail boss wanted to mark something worth marking. The cook who could make it held a different standing from other cooks. He was the one who understood that feeding men was not just about calories, it was about dignity. About reminding people, even men covered in trail dust in the middle of the American wilderness, that they deserved something someone had taken real trouble over. The great one-pot meals of the open range were all like this in the end. Born in poverty, refined by necessity, sustained by the simple human understanding that a good meal shared around a fire is not a small thing. It never was. It never will be. Try one of these this week. Son of a gun stew, if you can source the ingredients. Salt pork and beans, if you cannot. Spotted pup, if you just need something a cowboy called a celebration. Share which one you tried in the comments. I want to know if the vinegar pie surprises you the way it surprised me the first time I made it. These were not desperate survival meals. They were solutions. Smart, resourceful, deeply human answers to the question of how to feed people well when they had almost nothing. The Cowboys knew. The chuck wagon cooks knew. Now you do too.